A German shepherd once believed to have perished in a devastating landslide is still breathing, hidden beneath the thick mist of the nightshade forest, cared for by a wild troop of chimpanzees. No leash binds him, only the memory of a name he never forgot. Eli. When that man returns to the forest, an old red leash in hand, nature itself seems to hold its breath for the moment that could change everything. Why didn't Rex leave? What kept him there? And above all, who had he waited for all these years? The forest may hold the answer, but will it ever let him go? Before the first light of dawn could pierce through the thick veil of mist, the forest of nightshade had already sunk into a silence too heavy to name. No wind stirred, no bird sang. The air hung thick and still, steeped in the scent of rotting leaves and damp, decaying roots. Morning light didn't pour in. It dripped, hesitantly, like it feared touching this place. A place where the roots of an ancient oak spread wide, like the fingers of some forgotten giant, clinging tightly to memories buried deep in the earth. And there, beneath those roots, lay Rex, curled up, trembling faintly, like a stone still shivering from a passing storm. A rope dug deep into the thick fur around his neck, now dust-gray and matted with dried blood. Each breath was a battle. His chest rose in uneven, jagged motions, as if even the act of staying alive required a strength he was fast running out of, but the breath was still there. Faint, lingering, enough to keep him tethered to a world that seemed to have forgotten him. Rex no longer remembered how long he'd been lying there. 3 days? A week? More? But memories didn't need time to return. They came in flashes, some as faint as a whisper on the wind, others like a pair of warm eyes emerging from the gray. Eli. That name was all Rex still held on to, not with his mind, but with his heart. The memories didn't come in full, only fragments. A rainy afternoon, Eli wrapping Rex in a blanket when he was just a pup, a sun-drenched hill where they once ran side by side, and a final mission, soaked in smoke and screams and the flicker of red lights, until the earth gave way and the darkness swallowed him whole. But Rex had never feared that darkness, because deep inside he believed Eli would come back. And even now, that belief, however blurred by time, was what kept his eyes open every morning, no matter how faint the light. A lone crow swept overhead and landed on the branch above him, shaking off its wet wings before tilting its head to peer down. It didn't caw. It simply watched, like a sentinel, and in the space between Rex's broken breaths, the sound of wings returned again, fainter, yet accompanied by a rustling deeper in the woods. A branch snapped. A whisper of movement brushed against the mossy forest floor. Rex didn't turn his head, not out of weakness, but because he knew what was coming carried no threat, only a presence like the breath of the forest itself. 3 figures emerged from the mist, long-limbed, low to the ground, eyes black and sharp, not with menace, but with raw instinct. Leading them was Braca, tall, broad, his dark fur rippling with each step, and a scar slashing across his left eye like the mark of some brutal survival. Braca didn't rush forward. He stood several feet from Rex, simply watching. The way he tilted his head, sniffed the air, and met Rex's eyes without blinking. It wasn't how one animal judged another. It was how a soul looked upon another soul, caught in the trials of the wild. Behind him, 2 smaller chimpanzees, Nomi and Rix, moved slowly along the edge, never crossing the invisible boundary Braca had drawn with his stance. They didn't grunt or call out. They simply were, silent as the forest that had chosen silence as its language. Rex closed his eyes, but his ears stayed alert. A breeze passed, and with it, something familiar, not the forest, human, a faint trace of old smoke, damp clothing, and worn leather from a leash long lost. Eli's scent, maybe imagined, maybe real, but enough to make Rex's heart thump, once, loud and clear. His body twitched. Instinct pulled him upward, though his legs had long gone numb. He braced his shoulders, claws digging into soft roots, lifting his head by inches. A soft whine escaped his throat, not in pain, but as a declaration. I'm still here. Braca moved for the first time, a slow step forward. He stopped just before Rex, lowered his head. It wasn't a display of dominance, it was acknowledgement. Then, carefully, he extended one long arm, letting his fingers graze the blood-stained rope around Rex's neck. Nomi stepped in, quietly, calmly. He sat and began to untie the knots, one by one, patiently, like peeling away the remnants of something long forgotten. Time passed wordlessly. The forest stayed cold, but in that small space between Rex and the creatures surrounding him, something subtle began to shift. And when the final knot loosened and the rope fell away, Rex didn't leap up. He just exhaled, not out of relief, but because, for the first time in days, he felt something close to trust. A drop of water touched his nose, not from the sky, but from Rex's hand. The young chimp had dipped his fingers into a dew-covered leaf, and now gently pressed them to Rex's mouth. Cold water touched cracked lips. Rex licked it slowly, not to quench thirst, but to remember it, the taste of nameless kindness. Finally, Braca sat down beside him. One massive arm stretched over Rex, not to restrain, not to possess, just to shelter, a makeshift canopy for a body on the brink. Beneath the old oak, warmth spread, not from fire, but from the quiet bond forming between lives that were never meant to meet. Morning light began to touch the highest leaves. A few golden beams broke through, scattering on the ground like washed clean memories. Rex didn't know what those creatures were, but something deep within him, some primal instinct, told him he wasn't alone. And Eli, maybe, just maybe, was on his way back. Far off, where the forest still slumbered, the wind stirred the treetops ever so gently, like someone whispering a name. Rex. Morning in the outskirts of Grayson usually began with the neighbor's rooster crowing and the soft mist clinging to weather-worn wooden fences. But for Eli Wren, those sounds had never been peaceful. They were just the familiar backdrop to a nightmare that had never truly left. His house sat at the very end of a dirt road, tucked close to the edge of the nightshade forest, a place no one had dared enter since the landslide. From a distance, it looked like a forgotten shack, with faded gray shingles and smoke curling lazily from the chimney like a tired breath. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, almost lonely. A scratched wooden table, a torn-up couch, and by the door, hanging on a rusty hook, an old, faded red leash still crusted with dried mud. Eli stood there, hand resting silently on the cold metal clasp. The hook was still firm, but the fabric had frayed so much that even brushing it sent tiny fibers loose. He slowly lifted it from the hook and let it sit in his palm, as if it were something once alive, and lost in his hands. No one in town mentioned Rex anymore. No one asked about the rescue dog who had once earned a medal for finding 4 victims buried in the 2017 landslide. And no one brought up the fact that Rex had been the only one to go back into the danger zone for the last child, and never came out. But Eli never forgot. Not for a single day. He placed the leash on the table beside a steaming mug of coffee. The scent mingled with the damp morning air, and just like that, he was back in a memory. The smell of Rex's fur after a bath, that mix of sun and earth and something uniquely German shepherd. Once, Eli had joked, "You're just a walking sponge for the woods, huh, Rex?" And Rex had only panted happily, tail wagging like he agreed. Now, only the leash remained, and the memories, returning in fragments, like tiny cracks spidering through glass that once seemed unbreakable. Rex's death, or at least his disappearance, wasn't just a tragic accident. It had happened on a day like this. Eli and the rescue team had been dispatched to the western edge of Nightshade after days of relentless rain had triggered a massive landslide. An entire family had been buried. When the team cleared the final debris, a child's cry rang out. Weak, distant, but unmistakable. Rex had bolted ahead, no command given, none needed. Eli barely managed to shout, "Wait!" before the sturdy black figure vanished into the crumbling earth. 13 minutes later, the second slide hit. The ground gave way again, swallowing everything. When the tremors stopped, when the shouting faded into stunned silence, and when shovels began their desperate digging, they found the child alive. But there was no sign of Rex, just a red leash, half buried in the soil, the other end torn off. No one believed any dog could survive a burial like that. But Eli never believed in Rex's death. He only saw him in dreams. The dreams came unevenly. Some nights, Rex stood in the forest rain, eyes filled with hurt. Other times he was curled beside Eli, soaked, shivering, but never letting him touch. And sometimes Rex was just a silhouette in the distance, still wearing the old leash. Never broken, just never removed. Eli stepped out onto the porch, still holding the leash. His eyes scanned the tree line far beyond, where the nightshade forest remained so dense that even morning light couldn't push away the mist. He sipped the cold coffee. Bitter, tongue-numbing, but it jolted his heart back to life. Yesterday he had received an email, no sender name, just a single line of text. A gray-coated dog, drooping ears, limping, seen living with chimps in the southern woods. Looks a lot like the one in your photo. Nothing else. No image, no coordinates, no proof. But that one line had kept Eli awake all night. He looked down at the leash in his hand. The dull metal clasp caught the soft light of dawn, just like Rex's eyes used to when they understood, with quiet certainty, that Eli would never leave him behind, even if the world fell apart. Maybe it was a prank, maybe it was just a stray, but Eli knew one thing. German shepherds are not easily mistaken. The way they walk, the tilt of their head when their name is called, that look in their eyes. No dog was ever quite like Rex, and if it was Rex, then he had survived all this time. Not because someone saved him, but because he had once saved others. His survival, if it was real, was the clearest reminder Eli could ever receive. No one gets left behind. Not even a dog. Eli rehung the leash on its hook, not to let go, but to make a promise. He stepped inside, pulled open the zipper of his old backpack. Gloves, utility knife, water bottle, flashlight, a worn map of the forest, the folds still creased along the trail Rex had last taken. In the corner of the room, the rescue jacket he had folded years ago still lay untouched. Eli slipped it on, zipping it up to his chest. The fabric was tighter now, worn by time, but snug enough to keep his heart from trembling with fear. On the cabinet above, a small photo was pinned beneath a magnet. Eli sitting, Rex standing beside him, both of them soaked but smiling like nothing in the world could ever go wrong. He didn't say goodbye. He simply stepped across the threshold, brushing his fingers against the leash one last time. The nightshade forest lay ahead. And if anything still held the gaze of a dog once believed gone, it was waiting for him. In every leaf, every faint paw print, every breath buried deep in the forest floor. Eli walked forward. And this time, he wouldn't return alone. The morning wind slithered through the trees like a living thing, threading its way through roots and underbrush, carrying with it the scent of dampness, cold, and something halfway between a warning and a whisper. The musk of wet soil mingled with the mist, blending into the breath of nightshade, a kind of air meant only for those who knew what it meant to be feral. Rex still lay beneath the great oak, the rope cinched tight around his neck, one end buried deep into the tree bark like fate itself had tethered him there. The rope was frayed, but strong enough to keep a weakened dog from breaking free. Dried blood clung to his once sleek gray coat, now matted in patches. His front legs were braced but shaking, no longer able to lift the body that had once barreled through rubble, leapt from cliffs, and dragged a life from drowning mud. Above, the sky had changed, no longer the charcoal of night, but not yet the soft blue of day. It hung in between, hazy, uncertain, like the fragile boundary between life and the forgetting that threatened to take Rex. But Rex had not surrendered. No one taught him how to endure. No one ordered him to survive. But loyalty needed no instruction. It existed, like breath, like a heartbeat, even when that beat grew faint and nearly still. Rex turned his head, clamping his teeth onto the rope near his neck. Each bite sent pain radiating through his shoulders. But he didn't stop. Somewhere, buried in memory, a voice echoed. Not loud, not clear, but powerful enough to stir his deepest instinct. "Don't leave anyone behind, Rex, not even yourself." The coarse rope slowly began to wear under the pressure of his gnawing. Blood pooled in his mouth, but he didn't let go. His eyes, though dimmed, fixed on a single point ahead, as if he could see something no one else could. A figure, an outstretched hand, a name spoken through the mist. Eli. The wind stirred the dense canopy above, casting long beams of light through the gloom. One narrow ray landed where Rex lay, so delicate it felt like an invisible hand brushing his forehead. His back moved, not forcefully, but steadily, as if the light itself lent him strength. Nightshade was not easily forgiving, but it wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. To the creatures who endured, it would test, and if they passed, it would protect. Rex dragged himself forward. Claws scraped the cold earth, dragging his weighted body inch by inch. Every movement felt like a blade against his ribs, but each tug loosened the knot, slackened the noose. The scent of fresh blood crept into the air. Not strong, but enough to awaken every sense nearby. Shadows in the forest, watchful eyes from afar, stirred again. The chimps didn't return, but the forest was still watching. Silent, alert. At last, Rex managed to slip the rope beneath his chest, free of its final knot. Blood filled his throat, but his jaws remained locked, because pain was the only thing keeping him alert. Then came a faint snap. The sound of fiber pushed beyond its limit. His body collapsed forward, back scraping the cold dirt, mouth open in a sudden, gasping breath. For the first time in days, nothing held him down. But this wasn't freedom. It was the beginning. Rex lay there for a long while, listening to the broken rhythm of his own heart, each beat echoing softly through his chest. The wind paused. Leaves rustled high above. Everything slowed, as if the world had granted him a moment to choose. Stay down, or rise. Hunger still clawed at him. Thirst hadn't eased. The cold had sunk into his very bones, but something had sparked. Not strength, not yet. Just the idea of return, not to be comforted, but to be called by name again. Rex shifted, dragging himself toward the edge of the roots, where a tiny leaf cradled morning dew. He licked the droplets gently, each one like medicine for the soul. His throat, raw and scorched, began to soothe. His eyes slowly closed, not in exhaustion, but to commit the sensation to memory. The feeling of being alive, without needing anyone to tell him so. At the edge between life and wilderness, Rex had just rescued himself for the very first time. And it was in that very moment, far away, down near the dry creek bed at the forest's lower tier, that the sound of human footsteps broke across snapped twigs. Not hurried, not heavy, just a rhythm so familiar that, had Rex been fully awake, he would have recognized it even in a dream. Another gust of wind swept through. The forest whispered again, this time not in warning, but as if speaking directly to Rex. Go. That person is searching. And though Rex couldn't stand just yet, he began to shift, turning his head toward the sound, as if instinct alone had already begun to guide him. The search had begun. But Rex, worn, wounded, and barely breathing, was the first one who hadn't given up. As dusk settled over the nightshade forest, the air thickened like an invisible shell wrapping around every movement. The calls of forest birds grew sparse. No leaves fell. No branches stirred. As if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something unnamed. Rex lay cradled in a shallow patch of earth, nestled between the roots of 3 ancient trees. His body was blanketed in dust and moss, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, his eyes half-lidded. The exhaustion hadn't left, but his breath no longer broke into fragments. Each inhale whispered, I'm still here. In that hazy space between waking and dream, Rex heard the first sign, not a voice, but a soft rustling sound, like wind scratching against a dried tree trunk. But wind didn't make footsteps. Wind didn't pause to look. They were standing there. 4 silhouettes, quiet as shadows, hidden behind layers of leaves and twilight so perfectly that fur and darkness blurred into one. At the front was Braca, the largest male, weighing nearly 100 kilos, his frame thick with muscle, hunched with time, and a long scar stretching from his cheek to the edge of his left eyelid. He didn't move, save for his eyes as black as pebbles in the bottom of a deep stream, yet glimmering with something not easily named. Caution, compassion, or perhaps just curiosity. Behind him stood Nomi, a smaller, quick-footed female who fidgeted with her fingers like a child toying with blades of grass. The other 2, Rix and Zara, were younger, their roles in the group still undefined, but neither took their gaze off Rex for even a second. The 4 of them remained just beyond the reach of the light filtering through the canopy, yet their stares pressed into Rex's chest like a silent weight. They didn't growl. They didn't approach, nor did they retreat. They simply watched, as though deciding whether the creature before them deserved the forest's voice. Rex didn't rise. He merely turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Braca. A moment passed, wordless but long, like the final breath of something that refused to end. And in that moment, the forest was no longer a place of danger. It became a quiet arena, where 2 animals from opposite ends of evolution exchanged something ancient through a single glance. Braca lowered his body, arms steady as if prepared to crawl forward. But he went no farther. He sniffed the air. Blood. Man. Rope. The lingering scent of old smoke clinging to Rex's fur. And something else. The faded trace of loyalty long abandoned. Nomi was the first to break the stillness. She walked over to a nearby stone, crouched down, and used a dry stick to draw lines in the dirt like a child learning to write. She didn't face Rex, didn't look him in the eye, but the soft tilt of her head, the downward gaze, revealed a sensitivity that surpassed wild instinct. Zara rolled a small forest berry in her hand, then placed it gently on the ground near where Rex lay. Not too close to threaten, but near enough to be seen. A gesture. A silent question. Can you still eat? Rex stared at the berry. He didn't move, didn't growl, he just understood. Something deep inside him, whether a primal thread woven into the fabric of wilderness or a ghost of memory passed down from ancestors, recognized that this wasn't an intrusion. It was a test of trust. Braca sat down, arms crossed over his knees, the sharpness in his gaze softened. He watched Rex's reaction, not as a predator eyes its prey, but as a tribal elder assesses a stranger who's wandered into sacred land. A breeze slid through. Moss from the treetops drifted like pale dust. Rex shifted a paw, claws tracing a faint line in the soft soil. He lifted his head slightly. No bark, no whimper, just a gentle tilt, the familiar motion he always made when Eli called his name. No one called him this time. But still he tilted his head, as if the forest itself had whispered, "Rex," through the wind. Braca saw it, and something behind the old warrior's eyes gave way, not in surrender, but in understanding. He didn't step closer. He simply stood, turned, and gave Nomi a light tap on the shoulder, a signal to fall back. The group departed as quietly as they had arrived, slipping out of view like pieces of the forest melting into the shadows. Only Zara glanced back once, eyes flicking to the berry still lying untouched in the dirt. No one took it, but its presence, left behind like a thread connecting the wild to the fragile thread of trust, spoke louder than any gesture. As the last light dipped below the canopy's edge, Rex remained, eyes barely open. He wasn't dreaming. But if there had been a dream in that fleeting moment, perhaps it was the dream of another kind finally seeing him, and not looking away. The forest had not welcomed Rex, but it no longer threatened him, and for a survivor, being accepted was the first step toward finding the way back. At dawn, the next day, mist hung so thick it looked as if the earth had been steeped in white smoke. The cold, damp air soaked through Rex's dense fur, making every muscle under his skin contract in a survival reflex. But this time, the sensation no longer carried the sharp sting of loneliness. It felt like a presence, quiet but not hostile. From within the fog, the familiar rustle returned. Not rushed, not sneaky, just the forest breathing, its rhythm strangely aligned with Rex's fading heartbeat. The first shape to emerge was Braca, still the leader, still carrying the same calm as the night before, but this time holding a large bunch of leaves dripping with water from some nearby stream. Without a wasted sound, Braca stepped closer to where Rex lay, kneeling beside him. In the pale glow of newborn sunlight, the long scar across his face caught the light, as did his deep, dark eyes, the only thing in this forest that hadn't changed shade. Rex opened his eyes, lids cracked and dry, but the pupils reflected something watchful yet unresisting. No growls, no defensive motion, just a quiet exchange between two creatures who'd each brushed the edge between life and death. Braca tilted his head, then leaned forward, letting droplets of water fall from the leaves onto Rex's lips. Cold beads trickled into the cracks of his parched mouth, rolling across his tongue with the taste of forest, minerals, and wind. Unlike any water Rex had ever known, but never had anything tasted so gentle. Rex didn't lick right away. He let the water rest there for a moment, as if weighing whether it could be trusted. Then, slowly, his tongue lifted, taking in the drops bit by bit. A soft sound came from the left, Zara crouching nearby with ripe forest berries cupped in her hands. She placed them on the ground. Not too close, not too far. Her eyes stayed on Rex, shimmering not with demand, but with patience, as if waiting not for a reaction, but for a relationship to begin. Behind her, Nomi and Rix appeared, each carrying odd little items. A stripped branch, a few leaves gently crushed, a flat stone washed clean. No one spoke, but each moved with quiet purpose, as if performing a ritual they'd done before, and now repeating it for a newcomer who had just been accepted. Braca's gaze never left Rex as he poured the last drops. Then he rose, stepping back, creating space between the group and the injured dog. And in that space, silence bloomed again. Not the silence of fear, but of something gentler. The kind of quiet where trust begins to grow. Sunlight now filtered through the leaves above, drawing shifting patterns across the forest floor like invisible fingers sketching symbols in motion. Rex tried to lift himself, but couldn't. Instead, he dragged himself forward with his front paws, inching toward the berries Zara had placed for him. He didn't eat right away. He sniffed softly, taking in the strange scent. The berries carried a mild sourness, laced with fresh grass and the musty moss underfoot. Rex licked one, then paused. A moment of hesitation. But then, in a subtle sign of acceptance, he bit down. The juice burst over his tongue, tart, wild, alive. The group stayed silent. No cheers, no celebration. But something in their eyes softened. Braca tilted his head, then turned away, stepping slowly toward a dense thicket. The others followed, never looking back, but walking just slowly enough for Rex to understand. If you want to follow, you can. Rex didn't rise, but he crawled, bit by bit, not to follow them, but to reach a nearby stone where sunlight hit directly. He lay down there, letting the warmth soak into his spine, eyes squinting in the glow. No defenses, no tension. For the first time in days, Rex wasn't lying in the shadow of death. He was lying in light. Hours later, with the sun high above, a branch snapped somewhere near the forest's edge. Not chimpanzee, not beast. It was the sound of boots. Human boots. Not far from where Rex lay, Eli moved carefully through the underbrush, eyes scanning the forest like he was trying to hear an old breath lost in time. But neither Rex nor Eli saw each other, not because of distance, but because the forest had not yet allowed it. Between them were small chimpanzee footprints, half-eaten berries, claw marks from a dog still fighting to exist. And behind Eli, sunlight spilled in golden strands, enough to light the path, but not enough to reveal everything. Because true companions don't always need names. Sometimes, they only need to face the light together. Late afternoon sun threaded through the canopy, laying soft patterns across Rex's fur like falling feathers. The air in the forest had eased, lighter than breath. Somewhere between the thick brambles, insects began to hum, the forest's quiet music, played only for those who'd survived one more day. Rex lay on his side, eyes half closed. The pain had dulled, though fatigue still gripped his every fiber. And in that hush, memories stirred, not in fragments or chaos, but as clear as if they'd happened just yesterday. The rain that year had fallen like a wall of water, sealing off the mountain town in sheets of flood. A once gentle stream turned into a violent torrent, tearing through homes, farms, and paths only locals had ever dared walk. Rex, then search dog, number 17 with the Rapid Response Unit, had followed Eli across slick roads and landslides, sniffing for the last traces of breath beneath broken ground. A child had been trapped inside a wooden cabin clinging to the hillside. Floodwater had risen all the way to the porch, and the roof's edge had already begun to crack. Eli had intended to go in first, but Rex had darted ahead like a streak of gray lightning. No command needed, no protection required. He slipped through a rear opening, where the floor was nearly neck-deep in water. The child was trembling in the attic, eyes swollen red from smoke and fear. Rex scratched softly at the wooden ladder, gave a single bark, then lay down, signaling the child to climb onto his back. In those fleeting seconds between life and death, the dog had done something not every human could. By the time Eli arrived, all he saw was a swirling pool of black water. and the last trace was a gray figure leaping into the current, wrapping its body around the child, pushing desperately toward the far bank. The sound of excavators, shouts, ambulance sirens, they all bled into a single blur of chaos that day. When they pulled the child from the sludge, he was still clutching a torn fragment of red leash. The metal clasp at the end had snapped clean off. No one found Rex. 3 days later, the rescue team called off the search. They posthumously awarded Rex a Medal of Honor, recognizing his extraordinary sacrifice in the line of duty. Eli didn't attend the ceremony. He returned home in silence, placed the old leash back on its hook, and from that day forward, never spoke Rex's name again. Now, deep in the heart of Nightshade Forest, where the line between past and present was as fragile as the morning fog, Rex lay still, quietly remembering that final moment. There were no floods now, no smoke, only a familiar sound, Eli's desperate cry echoing through the rain, ringing out like a goodbye that never quite ended. Rex, come back. His name. The name once called out hundreds of times, during training, during missions, in play, in stern affection. But that time, it had been the last, a sound heavy with helplessness, aching with farewell that never landed. Rex whimpered softly, his throat dry, the taste of morning berries still clinging to his tongue. He didn't remember every detail, but the feeling of being called by his name, the sense of belonging, that remained whole. A soft wind passed by, dropping a few dark leaves before Rex's nose. In that moment, he lifted his head, ears perked, eyes scanning the trees, not in fear, but in search of that familiar sound the wind might carry back. But there was only silence. The chimps hadn't returned since morning. Perhaps they'd followed the stream or gone looking for food, but the forest no longer felt like a threat. Now it was a place that listened, waiting to see if Rex still had the strength to do what he once did, rise and move forward. A squirrel darted across the rock nearby, pausing for a heartbeat before leaping up into the trees. Its movements were quick, weightless, but Rex's eyes followed, not out of hunger, not from instinct. He watched because that little pulse of life carried something with it, a quiet reminder. This is the world you once saved. And it's still here. Rex shifted, testing his back legs. The pain was there, but no longer clawing at him. He pushed up with his front legs, lifting his chest from the earth. Muscles strained, shoulders trembled, but he had lifted half his weight. Rex rose to his knees, breathing hard, eyes wide, and then, without warning, he pressed down with both hind legs and stood, on all fours, for the first time in days. The wind brushed against his back like a pat. The rustling leaves above sounded like applause. No one witnessed it. No one praised him. But Rex knew the forest had acknowledged him. Beneath the old canopy, under the golden hue of fading light, a dog once hailed as a hero stood again. And that night, in the haze of sleep, for the first time in countless nights, Rex heard his name being called. Clear, warm, and unhurried. Rex, I'm looking for you. At dawn, the sky wore a veil of mist like breath lingering after a long dream. Along the dirt road leading to the forest's edge, Eli parked his car at the crest of a slope, the windows still rolled up, his hand having long since slipped from the wheel. Ahead of him, the first beam of sunlight broke away from the gray clouds, casting a slanting light onto the weathered wood of a long, faded sign. Restricted area, landslide hazard. Eli looked at it, not in fear, but in silence. Because behind every cracked letter on that board, old images stirred. A red leash left trailing on the ground, rocks collapsing in thunder without lightning, and the name Rex shouted for the last time beneath a rain-drenched sky. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket. Inside, The note was still there, creased but intact. A single scrawled line written in black ink. "Gray dog, drooping ears, scar on the left leg, looks like yours. Saw it near the southern creek, traveling with a few chimps." No name, no origin, no sender. But the messy handwriting had been enough to keep Eli from sitting still. He stepped out of the car, boots sinking gently into the damp mud left by the previous night's rain. In his hand, he held the red leash, the one he had meant to pack away in a memory box but never could. Eli inhaled deeply, eyes fixed on the darkened gap slowly opening between the two ancient trees ahead. Many years had passed since that day. Nightshade Forest was no longer a place people wanted to return to, but Eli had never truly left. Not in his mind. He'd only been waiting for a reason, and now that reason was guiding him back. The forest didn't welcome him with bird song or wind. It greeted him with a heavy silence. Each step he took echoed with the crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots, the brush of branches against his jacket, and the faint pounding of his heart, muffled in his chest. Eli moved carefully, as if one wrong turn might cause the forest to twist in on itself and swallow him whole. But he hadn't come to escape this time. He had come to find a life that had once saved his own. A folded, weathered map was strapped to the side of his backpack. He'd circled the area near the southern stream, the place the anonymous witness had mentioned. It was a part of the forest once severed by floodwaters, now overgrown and long abandoned by surveys or search parties. He followed old trails, many nearly hidden beneath creeping vines. Thorny branches scratched at his arms, leaving shallow red marks. But he didn't care. Every branch he pushed aside, every patch of mud he stepped through, felt like peeling back the layers that had dulled his memory for so long. And then, around a narrow bend where the stream flowed beneath a layer of rock, he saw it. The first sign. Not a dog, but a footprint. 4 toes. Long. Even. The print was larger and deeper than any wild dog's, and next to it, marks from primate fingers. Eli knelt down, fingers brushing the edge of drying mud. A small pocket of water still clung to the rim. The tracks hadn't been there long. He looked around. The wind hissed gently between the trees. The forest remained silent. But Eli felt it, something watching from afar, not threatening, not welcoming, just observing. Then, as if by reflex, he pulled the red leash from his jacket pocket. The cold metal clasp pressed into his palm. He said nothing. He simply held it up to the light cutting through the canopy, and for the first time in all those years he whispered, "Rex, I'm here." No voice answered, but Eli knew. The breeze, the rustling leaves, the quiet tremor in his chest, all were answering in their own way. He continued along the stream's edge, stepping through shallow bends, climbing over boulders once torn loose by the flood. On the far side, claw marks on rotting wood, scratched earth at the base of trees, slowly began to form a path. Faint, but real. A branch snapped behind him. Eli froze. He turned, but saw only leaves shifting in the breeze, and then the glimpse of something slipping behind a bush, low to the ground, quick, a thick, furred back, not a wild dog, not a feral cat, and not a man. He didn't move, eyes locked in the direction of that movement, his hand tightened around the leash. For a second, a gray snout appeared behind the brush, and eyes, deep, brown, filled with something ancient and searching. Eli didn't call out, he just smiled. Even if it was an illusion, or real, Eli understood. Those footprints weren't meant to lead him astray. They were there to guide him home. Rex, was still somewhere in this forest, and this time if he had to walk into the deepest shadows to find him, Eli would not turn back. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above, no longer harsh but softened into delicate beams, settling onto the damp forest floor like the forest's own fingerprints. Wind threaded its way between the ancient oaks, carrying the scent of fresh grass, decaying moss, and something else, something like the earth whispering its secrets through warmth. In the middle of that quiet space, Rex shifted. The pain wasn't numb anymore, but still sharp enough to send a sting through every strained movement. Yet something had changed. It wasn't the pain that had awakened him. It was a clear, unmistakable feeling. Someone was approaching. His 4 paws touched the ground, still trembling. But Rex's eyes were sharp again, lit with the same quiet fire he once held during rescue drills. That glint, the one that used to make Eli smile during early morning training. A breeze stirred through the forest, lifting the fur along his back, and in that passing breath came a familiar scent. Human scent. Sweat mixed with worn fabric, metal, and the distinct smell of the old leash that had once hung around his neck for 8 years. Rex didn't bark, but his heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from hope rising like a drumbeat trapped in his chest. Beyond a low ridge, Braca and Zara had emerged. They didn't move closer, didn't make a sound. They simply stood where the light broke apart, eyes following Rex's every motion. Up above, Nomi swayed from a tree limb, fingers playing with a cluster of leaves, head tilted, like she too was listening to something only the forest could hear. Braca lowered his head, placed a hand gently to the earth, and tapped, soft, deliberate. It was the same gesture he used to rouse the youngest from sleep. There was no command, but Rex understood. The chimp clan knew something was shifting. And now it was time for a creature raised in the light of training grounds to return to the rhythm of the world. Rex looked out toward the distant woods, where sunlight had been blocked by trees felled in that old landslide. He saw no figure, but he heard the breath of the land, steady and deep, in sync with footsteps approaching. It was as though the forest was sending a signal through every leaf, every trickle of underground stream, every swirl of wind teasing his nose. This was no longer a mirage. Eli was coming. For the first time in days, Rex lifted his left leg and pressed it down into the soft earth. Mud clung to his paw, but his claws still held firm. The trembling had dulled. His ears perked, focused toward the slightest sounds, the soft pull of a zipper, the crunch of boots on moss, the faint rasp of fabric brushing against a weathered red leash. Rex left the tree. Step by step, he dragged himself across the shallow depression, pushing through fallen leaves, until he reached a slanted shaft of light, a natural corridor formed between 2 rows of trees. His gaze stayed fixed on an undefined point in the distance, but his body had drawn tight, like an arrow straining toward flight. A single leaf drifted down, landing softly on Rex's nose. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He only tilted his head slightly, the way he always had when someone called his name. Another gust swept through, this time clearer. Not the forest's scent anymore, human scent. Eli's. At that same moment, Eli crossed the edge of a dry creek bed, shirt damp with sweat, cuffs muddied from the climb. He paused at a raised patch of earth, eyes scanning in all directions. Nothing visible. But his heart pounded wildly, as if his body understood before his mind could catch up. His hand reached instinctively to his belt, letting the red leash fall to his side. The metal clasp caught the light, glinting like a beacon against the green-gray wild. "Rex," he called. Softly, barely above a whisper. And not far off, behind a dense thicket, Rex stopped. No one had ever taught a dog what his name meant. But for Rex, the sound wasn't just a signal, it was memory. It was the affirmation that he belonged to someone. He took another step. A branch cracked beneath his paw. Eli looked up. His hand tightened around the leash, and then their eyes met. That gaze was no longer bright. The fur was patchy, ears drooped, body hollowed by time. But Eli knew, in that moment when the entire forest seemed to hold its breath, that it was Rex. Neither moved, neither cried out. They just looked at each other. And in that stillness, older than any spoken word, every unspoken truth, every year of separation, every wound once thought unhealable, dissolved into a single breath, the breath of the earth, the breath of life, the breath of something that had never truly died. Farther north, where the nightshade forest grew thick and the sun could no longer reach the ground, Lena crouched over a muddy indentation pressed into the decaying leaves. She brushed 2 fingers around the edge of the print and brought them to her nose. "Still fresh," she murmured, steady and sure. Behind her, Kate, small backpack on, binoculars slung across her chest, untangled her hair from a snagged branch and whispered, "Same tracks again, alongside primate markings. But this isn't a native ape trail. Lena, I think something else is happening in this forest." Lena said nothing. Her eyes narrowed, focused on the dim light flowing from the hillside into the lower groves, where the forest said nothing aloud, yet somehow always knew how to tell a story. Not far away, at a forest trail just wide enough for a truck to cross, Doyle Rusk stood alone beside an old off-road vehicle, its back door left wide open. The storage compartment was nearly empty, except for a carefully wrapped rifle, a pouch of ammunition, and a neatly folded survival knife set. His fingers traced the name etched into the gun stock. An old name, his own, carved back when he was still part of the regional security team. He spat on the ground, eyes cold and metallic. "A dog clings to life like a rag, and now it's running with monkeys?" he scoffed. Crumpled in the pocket of his coat was a torn flyer he'd pulled from the town bulletin board. On it, a scrawled message from some anonymous hand. "The dog is still alive, near the southern creek, but it's not alone anymore." Doyle knew exactly which dog that meant. Rex, the same dog that had gotten him demoted after the incident during the flood, when he'd discharged his weapon in a heated argument. Rex had thrown himself between Doyle and a child. No one was seriously hurt, but the backlash had been enough to end Doyle's career. Since then, Rex had become a stain he could never scrub away. And now this news, this flicker of unfinished business, rekindled a fire that had never truly died. "I'm ending this," he muttered, pulling his cap down low and stepping into the forest, hand locked around the rifle, already chambered and ready. Meanwhile, Lena and Kate, armed with nothing but an old camera and a few weathered field notebooks, were deep in nightshade for reasons that had nothing to do with curiosity. They'd come because something had gone eerily quiet in the wild. Birds had changed their flight paths, trails were disturbed by unfamiliar tracks. Then came the rumor, "There's a dog living with chimpanzees." For most, just an odd tale. But for Lena, a longtime researcher of animal behavior, it was a lead she couldn't ignore. "Kate, look there," Lena said, pointing toward a water-smoothed rock beside the creek. A fresh, muddy print was pressed clearly into its surface, 4 legs, muscular form, and a long scar mark etched alongside the shape of a rear leg. Kate's mouth fell open. "It's exactly like the message described, and there's a half-eaten berry here, too." They said nothing else. But at that moment, a shared instinct rose in both of them. They were close. Elsewhere, Rex stood in the middle of a narrow path blanketed with soft moss. He didn't run, didn't shift. He just listened, ears tilted to catch even the faintest tremor, like the ground itself was whispering to his paws. The wind still carried Eli's scent, but now, woven into it, was something else. Metal, gun oil, and old human leather. Rex tilted his head, eyes widening. His throat vibrated faintly, not from fear, but from a deep, absolute alertness. Behind him, Braca and Zara moved into a sweeping arc, not charging, but shifting into a protective stance. The forest remained silent, but every broken twig under Doyle's boots beat like a slow drum of warning. From another direction, Lena and Kate followed a low trail, stopping abruptly as they spotted the figure of a man up ahead. Gray jacket, rifle in hand, eyes scanning without pause. Lena pulled Kate down behind the roots of a thick tree, whispering, "He's not a scientist, not forest patrol either." "A hunter?" Kate breathed. "Worse," Lena replied. "Someone who knows exactly what he's after." Kate shivered. And between the two groups, one watching, one hunting, Rex was waiting for the forest to decide. No one knew what would happen next, but high above, a black bird cut across the canopy, releasing two sharp cries into the sky before fading into the trees. It wasn't an omen, it was a sign. The silence was ending. In a narrow grove where the ground lay unnaturally flat, like the forgotten courtyard of an ancient world, sunlight streamed through a web of branches and struck the thin, weathered back of Rex. He stood there, still, breath held. 4 legs rooted like stakes in the earth, his eyes locked onto the figure just a few steps ahead. Eli. No words were spoken. Even the forest seemed to hush. Only silence remained, the raw soundtrack of moments when beings long separated by time and pain finally met again. Rex didn't wag, didn't whine, didn't run. He looked at Eli, not with the eyes of a dog, but with the weight of a soul once buried in earth and memory, now searching for the answer to a single question. "Can I still trust you?" Eli didn't speak either. In his hand was the old red leash, faded, its clasp worn smooth, but he didn't extend it. Instead, he bent slightly, lowering himself to eye level, and tilted his head just a bit. A small gesture. But it said everything. "I'm not commanding. I'm asking." A few steps behind Rex, Braca and Zara appeared, silent as stone. They didn't growl, didn't scratch, didn't posture like wild beasts. They stood still, eyes fixed on Eli, not with hostility, but with the caution of those who had seen death up close too many times and were now learning, slowly, to tell friend from intruder. Braca tilted his head slightly to the right. In their tribe, that was a signal, not to advance, not to retreat. Just wait. Rex turned to glance back at the ones who had sheltered him when his body was broken, when no one else believed he was still alive. Then he looked to Eli, the one who had stood beside him on the edges of storms, collapsed houses, and search and rescue missions. And in that invisible space that once bridged man and dog. He stood at the crossroads of 2 worlds, one of wilderness, where instinct and earth had healed his wounds, and one of humanity, where memory and affection had carved his name into the heart of another being. A gentle breeze passed through. The red leash in Eli's hand swayed slightly, its metal clasp brushing against the button of his pants with a sound so soft, so familiar, that Rex flinched. His ears perked up. Eli whispered, no louder than the wind, "If you still trust me, just 1 step, Rex." Rex leaned forward. The ground shifted beneath his paws. No one urged him. No signal was given. But his eyes began to glisten, not with tears, but with the reflected light from the man who had once been his whole world. Zara stepped forward half a pace, placing a gentle hand on Rex's shoulder. A small gesture, asking, "Are you sure?" Rex tilted his head toward her briefly. Then he stepped back, one step. Not forward, not away. Braca looked at Eli. The tension was gone from his eyes. What remained was the forest's final question, unspoken. "Are you worthy of this?" Eli lowered the leash to the ground. He didn't move forward. He simply sat, arms open, not to command, not to expect, just open. Rex stared at that empty space. In it, he saw hundreds of training days, cold nights on mountain ridges, naps curled by firelight at Eli's feet, now gathered in an embrace that never touched. And then, he stepped forward. The first step came slow. Then a second. His left leg buckled slightly, the old wound flaring. But he didn't stop. Eli didn't move, but his eyes filled. His hands remained open. His lips trembled, not in a smile, but in something older, softer. Rex stopped, an arm's length away. He raised his head. Eli whispered, voice breaking, "I'm sorry I didn't come for you sooner." And then, Rex wagged his tail. For the first time, not fast, not frantic, just one soft rhythm, like the quiet punctuation at the end of a long, unfinished song. But for Eli, it was everything. He bowed his head, not to embrace, not to hold. He simply reached forward and touched Rex's neck, where the leash once hung. There was no collar now, only a bond being rewoven in silence. Behind them, Braca gave a slow nod. Zara sat. Nomi swayed slightly in the trees and let out a soft, high-pitched call, the first sound since their tribe had appeared. Because in the end, the boundaries of trust are not decided by words or actions, but by the silence shared between two beings who had lost each other and chose not to turn away. Evening fell. Beneath the canopy of nightshade, the final light slipped between leaves and gave way to shadows threading through the roots. The air turned cool and wet with the breath of earth. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something fragile and inevitable. In that clearing, Rex lay close beside Eli, his head resting on the man's leg, as if he'd circled life and death just to return to this place. His eyes were nearly closed, breath heavy, exhaustion etched into every movement of his chest. But when Eli gently stroked from the crown of his head down his spine, Rex didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled, slowly, as if all nightmares now belonged to the past. No words were spoken, because the most important things often need no sound at all. Lena and Kate crouched behind a low bush, no more than 20 meters away, wide-eyed, hearts pounding. "That's," Kate whispered, her voice catching. "That's the dog. It's really him." She lifted her binoculars, adjusting the focus. Beneath the moss-covered ground, moonlight was beginning to seep through the gaps in the canopy, falling directly on Rex's gray, wiry body. His fur was matted, but shimmered faintly in the light, like ash that still held fire. And beside him, the man's eyes weren't the hardened gaze of a rescue worker, but the aching softness of a father reunited with a child lost in the storm. "And," Lena's voice faltered, "the chimps. 5 of them, around him." Braca stood behind Rex, his hands resting firmly on a slab of stone, the lines of muscle rising beneath dark fur. Zara and Nomi sat low on the right, while Rix and Cura kept watch from the branches above. None approached Eli, but none withdrew. There was no tension now, only a quiet full of meaning, as though the entire tribe bore witness to a reunion they'd waited through weeks of bandaging wounds, collecting rainwater, and sitting still beneath storm-laden skies to see. Kate turned to Lena. "They're not threatening him. They're not attacking. I think they trust Rex, and now they're learning to trust him too." Lena narrowed her eyes. "But night's falling, and if we can see them..." then someone else might be watching, too. Far off, at the forest's sloping edge, Doyle Rusk stood still, one eye locked behind the rifle's scope. His finger teased the trigger, breath heavy from the climb. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the grin of a man who knows he holds the power of life and death. Through the rifle scope, he could see everything. Rex lying curled beside Eli, the chimpanzee tribe keeping guard, and two women who had just arrived, unaware they were already caught in his sights. "I should have done this from day one," Doyle muttered, eyes locked on the crosshairs. "There's no happy ending for a dog that ever dared get in my way." His finger began to squeeze the trigger. But at that exact moment, a branch snapped behind him. Doyle spun around, lowering the rifle, eyes darting through the darkness. But nothing. Only thick night and the rising chorus of insects, mocking him, as if the forest itself was laughing at his haste. He turned back to the scope. But now, Rex was gone. In truth, Rex had only lifted his head, ears raised. He had heard something, a step not from Eli, not from Lena or Kate, and most definitely not from Braca. His eyes shifted westward, where the layers of leaves were thickest, hiding a scent that was foreign, cold, metallic, and filled with malice. Braca moved half a step forward, silent. The entire troop shifted positions immediately, forming a crescent shield, placing Eli and Rex at the center. Eli said nothing. He simply placed a hand gently on Rex's shoulder, a silent message. "Don't fight. Let me protect you this time." But Rex didn't need protection, not entirely. He stood. His movements were shaky still, but his eyes no longer carried the look of a survivor. They bore the resolve of a creature prepared to defend what it now chose to believe in. Rex stepped forward and pressed his head softly into Eli's lap. A simple gesture, but a declaration, after everything. Trust still remained. Outside the clearing, Lena slipped her phone from her pocket, hands trembling. "Should I call this in?" Kate whispered. Lena looked towards the chimpanzees, then back to Rex's eyes as he looked up at the man who had once been his entire world. That gaze. It was too human. "No," Lena whispered. "We don't understand enough to decide anything." Kate nodded slowly. And in the forest's night, as the last traces of light disappeared, there was only breath and wind and a dog that had found his place again, not just between beast and man, but between right and wrong, between instinct and heart. There was no clear path through the dark, but for those who still carried light inside, the way forward could be found through trust. As night draped thicker over the towering trees, the whole of Nightshade seemed to contract into one tense, silent breath. No bird song, no wind strong enough to stir the canopy. Only the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pressing into the earth as if it, too, was bending under the weight. Doyle Rusk crept forward, hunched slightly, eyes locked on a narrow trail where moonlight had begun to slip through. In his hands, a dark rifle with a barrel long and menacing, whispering death. He had already chambered the round. Special ammo. Solid core, round-nosed steel, enough to drop a buck in a single shot. But this time, his target wasn't game. Sweat began to bead beneath his jacket, not from fear, but from a near-bloody thrill. He remembered the way Rex had looked at him that day. The day the dog leapt in front of the child, eyes that made a man like Doyle feel smaller than the creature before him. Tonight, he was here to take that back. One shot, not just to kill, but to erase, to wipe clean the one being that had turned him into the one who got cut loose. Not far away, in a shallow clearing where moonlight barely etched a silver line across the forest floor, Rex suddenly raised his head. No sound, no clear scent. But something had shifted in the air, so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, But not Rex. Not a dog trained on the edge of war, who knew the shape of death as it approached. Eli still sat against the base of a tree, his back leaning on damp bark, eyes half closed with fatigue. One hand rested gently on Rex's back, his fingers moving in idle strokes, as if trying to hold on to a dream. But Rex was no longer resting. A low growl rolled from his throat, not loud enough to raise alarm, but enough to make Eli's chest tighten. "What is it, bud?" he asked softly, eyes still closed. And then, a click. Faint, like metal sliding off a latch. Eli shot upright, his arm instinctively wrapped around Rex, eyes scanning the darkness for the source, but the shadows were too thick, the air too still. Rex was fully alert now, his tail tucked low, front paws braced, ears stiff, eyes locked on a line of trees no more than 20 paces away. No one could see. But someone was there. Above them, on a high branch, Braca had shifted stance. His right hand gripped the bark tightly, body tensed like a bowstring drawn to its limit. He didn't move, but every muscle in his frame spoke of readiness. Below, Zara and Rix crawled low across the forest floor, silent as mist, circling behind Eli, into the shadows where no light reached. Nomi swung gently above, one long finger pointing toward the western dark, then curling inward like a warning. "Danger is closing in from there." Doyle had reached his spot. Between two gnarled trunks, he crouched into position, rifle raised, eye behind the scope. And now, within the crosshairs, he saw them, a man and a dog, standing guard. Rex lifted his head high. Moonlight caught in his eyes, turning them into two glowing embers, quiet and burning. "I see you now," Doyle whispered. He raised the rifle. His finger slid onto the trigger. And just then, a breath, soft and warm, whispered against his ear. He spun. A pair of eyes, not human, stared from a branch just behind him. It was Rix. No growl, no roar, just one slow blink. And then he was gone. The forest exhaled all at once. A gust of wind stirred from the left. Doyle turned back to the scope. Rex was no longer there. "Damn it!" he hissed, yanking the trigger in frustration. Click. Nothing. The safety was still on. He fumbled to release it. Too late. A blur came at him from the side. Rex had launched across the clearing, with impossible force for a body once buried in dirt. He didn't bite, didn't tear, but slammed into the rifle, knocking it clean from Doyle's grip. It spun through the air and vanished into the brush. Doyle crashed to the ground. Before he could rise, Braca was already standing over him. No snarl, no blow, just staring. The forest held its breath. Eli stepped forward from behind, pulling Rex gently toward him. His hand came to rest on Rex's shoulder. A quiet hold, a silent thank you. Doyle pushed himself upright, eyes wide. Before him stood a circle, man, dog, and wild, unmoving, surrounding him. No one touched him, but no one would let him leave. The air was thick with tension. Then, from behind the brush, Lena and Kate emerged, frozen in place, speechless at what they saw, a man on the ground, surrounded by chimpanzees and a dog that looked as if it had just clawed its way back from death itself. "Oh my God," Kate breathed. Lena whispered, "This isn't just a story about a dog anymore." Eli stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "No one has to die tonight. But if you so much as touch that trigger again, the forest won't let you go." Doyle looked at him, then at Rex, then at Braca. The arrogance in his eyes was gone. What was left was something deeper than fear. Not fear of death, fear of not understanding the rules of this world anymore. Night mist slithered between the trees, silent as a warning too old to need words. The forest seemed to pause. No breeze, no bird call, even the falling leaves hung motionless in the air, pinned there by something unseen, a dread too sharp to name. At the center of it all, where moonlight bled through the canopy like a tear in the sky, Doyle Rusk stood again, hands gripping the short pistol now drawn from a backup holster. His face was bare, no more pretense, just rage, cold, hostile, burning. Opposite him, Eli stood still, unarmed, eyes steady, no panic, only the calm of a man who had once stared down death and now faced it again. Doyle stepped forward. The ground cracked beneath his boots like breaking bone. "I told you, Eli," he rasped through clenched teeth. "No one gets to take back what I lost. Not you, not that dog, not anyone." The pistol rose. The barrel, black and hollow, leveled at Eli's chest. In that moment, the entire forest held its breath. No words, no movement. Lena and Kate stood frozen behind, hands over their mouths. The chimpanzees rose to full height, eyes burning. Braca let out a low growl. Nomi crushed a branch to pulp in her hands. And in the middle of it all, Rex stepped forward. Slowly, one tired step at a time, on legs that once couldn't stand at all. "Rex, no," Eli whispered, but Rex didn't stop. He took another step, and another, until he was standing fully between Eli and Doyle. Head lowered, paws firm in the dirt, back arched in fatigue, but his eyes, brighter than ever. He didn't look at Doyle. He looked straight at the gun, as if to say, "If a life must be taken here, take mine." Doyle sneered, voice like a gust through broken glass. "Of course you would. Same damn look, dying for someone else like a fool." His finger tightened on the trigger. Eli lunged forward, but didn't make it, because Braca roared. Not a wild animal's sound, a fury long held back, a cry for all the pain that had gone unspoken, and the troop moved. In one coordinated sweep, they surged into a fan-like arc, closing the circle tighter around Doyle. He staggered back, gun still raised, but his breathing turned to gasps. Rex didn't move. No fear. No trembling. Just acceptance. Eli was now only a few feet behind him, panting, his eyes lit with fury. "You think you can shoot a dog in front of me and walk away from this forest alive?" he growled. Doyle let out a cracked laugh. "You think I care? I've lost everything. This is all I've got left." His hand trembled. Not from mercy, from the weight of his own unraveling. Rex stepped forward, half a pace, and at that exact second, Nomi, the smallest of the troop, dropped from the high branches, landing hard beside Doyle. Smack! Both palms slammed into the earth. Dirt exploded. Doyle flinched. The gun jerked, and Rex leapt. It didn't go for the man, nor the hand. It went for the gun. Rex's jaws clamped down on the pistol grip, firm, unrelenting, but didn't tear. He held it, squeezed it, forced him to let go. Doyle screamed. "Let go! Let minus exclamation mark!" But then Braca stepped forward. His eyes, deep, black, endless, locked onto Doyle's, as if trying to claw into his very soul and lay it bare. Braca's face hovered just inches from Doyle's. But he didn't strike, didn't kill. He took a single step back. Rex loosened his grip. The gun dropped to the forest floor. Doyle collapsed, hands trembling violently. No blood spilled. No lives were lost. Only a fragile line had been held, not with weapons, but with the faith of a creature that didn't know how to betray. Eli stepped forward, bent down, and picked up the gun. He ejected the rounds, tossed both pieces far into the brush. Then he turned and wrapped his arms around Rex, holding him tight, like holding a part of himself that he'd almost lost again. "You did good, buddy. You did good." A few feet away, Lena whispered to Kate. "I used to think only humans knew how to sacrifice for one another." Kate nodded softly. Seems like we still don't understand loyalty at all." And as the sky paled into dawn, the mist began to lift, revealing a scene none of them would ever forget. A dog standing before a gun. Not out of instinct, but out of choice. A silence stretched through Nightshade, taut like a bowstring just loosed. The thin fog drifted with the forest's slow breathing, making way for the first rays of morning to peek through the canopy, touching bark and leaf like a cautious greeting from the heavens. But it wasn't peace that filled the air. It was the hush before a storm, when every living thing holds its breath. And in the heart of that silence, Doyle Rusk, face ashen as cold ashes, slowly curled a trembling finger back onto the trigger. He thought he had lost control, but it was the hatred, never truly gone, that kept him from stopping. Click. The trigger tightened. Everything that followed happened in less than a heartbeat. Braca, silent, unreadable, lifted one arm, and like lightning tearing through still air, the troop launched. Wind shrieked as Zara darted from the right. Rix launched forward from behind. Nomi dropped like a drawn bow from above, and Kura slithered low through the underbrush like smoke over stone. The forest didn't roar through sound. It roared through action. The gun fired, a crack like a hammer to the chest of everyone watching. Bang! It didn't hit Eli. It didn't strike Rex directly, but it grazed across Rex's right shoulder, a slash like a claw of steel, blood blooming in thick crimson drops across the dead leaves. Rex staggered. Eli screamed and lunged. But before Doyle could pull the trigger again, Braca was in his face. No longer the calm primate of days before. Braca now moved like the forest itself, eyes burning not with personal fury, but the ancient wrath of every creature wounded by the cruelty of man. Doyle stumbled back, but fell. Zara seized his wrist and twisted. Crack! The snap echoed sharp. Doyle screamed, color draining from his face, but his fight was gone. Nomi stripped the weapon from his limp hand and flung it into the bushes as if discarding filth. Rix pressed him to the dirt, pinning him with the weight not of an animal, but of a guardian of nature's justice. Rex collapsed. But he didn't cry, didn't whimper. His eyes stayed fixed on Eli, as if to say, "Don't worry, I'm still here." Eli dropped to his knees beside him, arms wrapping around Rex's neck, feeling the warm blood soaking into his sleeves. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the overwhelming truth that once again, this dog had stood between him and death. "Rex, you saved me again, Eli whispered, eyes stinging. Braca turned his head. In a fleeting instant, his gaze met Rex's. No words, just recognition, and the forest seemed to understand. The ground trembled, not from apes, not from wind, but from the forest itself, answering. Birds burst from the trees above, wings slicing through dawn's stillness. From the underbrush came the cries of gibbons, the scatter of squirrels, the gallop of deer racing toward the light. Sounds, suppressed all through the long night, surged forth like a chorus rising from the lungs of the wild. Kate whispered, stunned and awed. "Lena, do you hear that? It's like..." The forest just screamed. Lena nodded, eyes locked on Rex. Not a scream, a roar, the roar of the forest. A heavy thud echoed. Braca had forced Doyle to his knees. Rix and Zara held his arms. Doyle no longer resisted, his eyes wild, not with pain, but the cold realization that he hadn't just lost. He had been rejected by the forest itself. Eli laid Rex on a coat spread gently over the earth. He tore his undershirt, pressed it to the wound, held it firm. Rex didn't cry out. He just breathed, heavy and steady. Braca stepped forward slowly and lowered himself, pressing his forehead to Rex's. Not a farewell? A ritual? A warrior's gesture reserved only for those accepted as blood. Rex blinked. Once, then closed his eyes, breathed deep, and lived. Above them, the sun began to crest the tree line. The first rays, gentle, not blinding, settled onto Rex's back like a quiet blessing. The troop released Doyle, leaving him crumpled on the forest floor. Not dead, not struck again, but abandoned, like a scar the forest no longer wished to carry. Eli rose, one arm supporting Rex, the other gripping the medical strap Kate had just handed him. Lena scanned the area and whispered, "We need to get him out of here, before the wound gets infected." Eli nodded, but before he took a step, he turned back and bowed his head to Braca. No words were spoken, but they all understood. There would be no other chance to say, "Thank you." Morning mist threaded through the ancient trunks of nightshade forest like wisps of smoke, curling gently around the old trees. In the blurred haze of the first sunlight, Rex lay still in Eli's arms, his head resting on Eli's thigh as if he had finally returned to where he truly belonged. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence that wrapped around them. An eerie quiet that was neither death nor peace, but something that lived between loss and hope, the fragile pause where one wrong heartbeat could collapse it all. Eli sat on the forest floor, holding Rex's body as if cradling a part of his own soul. His hands were soaked in blood, but they didn't tremble. He bent forward, his forehead resting gently on Rex's head, voiceless. There was only breath and the warmth of a dog he had once lost, now so fragile it felt like it could vanish at any second. The chimpanzees stood behind them. They were no longer just guardians of the forest. Now, they were a living barrier, shielding against wind, against wandering eyes, against any threat still lurking in the unseen corners of the woods. Braca's eyes stayed on Eli, but they no longer held a challenge. They carried trust. Lena knelt beside Rex and quickly unzipped her emergency kit. Kate pulled out gauze and antiseptic, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes firm with purpose. "Through the muscle, but it missed the artery," Lena whispered. "If we can keep him warm, he might make it." She looked up at Eli and gave a small nod. "There's still a chance." Eli inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, as if trying to hold the breath for both himself and the dog. He took off his jacket, folded it under Rex's belly, then tightened his grip slightly and whispered, "You're still breathing. That means hope's still here." Braca stepped forward, not fast, not slow, each step heavy as stone. He stopped beside Eli and Lena. One broad arm reached out, not to touch Rex, but to rest gently on Eli's shoulder. Both Lena and Kate froze. Eli looked up slowly. Braca stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then bowed his head. Just once. But it wasn't the gesture of a beast. It was the nod of one who had decided, "You are worth protecting." From deep within the woods, the sound of footsteps broke through the hush. Not rushed, not panicked, but steady, deliberate. Lena turned, eyes narrowing. "Someone's coming." Kate gripped her hand. Eli gently shifted to shield Rex. Braca raised a hand. Instantly, the chimpanzees spread out in a crescent, half guarding, half concealing. From the forest's shadow, two figures emerged, dressed in field rescue uniforms, with the regional insignia on their shoulders. They were the team Lena had called before the signal dropped. The lead figure spoke. "We received a distress call hours ago. Anyone injured?" Lena stepped forward. "Here, the dog. His name is Rex. He saved all of us." The man raised his eyes, locking gaze with Eli. Neither said a word, only nodded, like people who had lived through something larger than words could ever explain. Rex stirred slightly. Not much. but enough for Eli to feel a flicker of life in his limbs. Lena wrapped more gauze, her voice sharp with urgency. "He can't lose more blood. We need to move, now." Braca stepped back, giving way. The entire troop seemed to understand what was coming. Not danger, but farewell. Nomi crawled closer to Rex, gently placing a hand on his belly. Cora brought a small bunch of forest leaves, laying them beside his head like a parting gift. Eli looked at the creatures, his voice hoarse. "I won't let him die. I owe you everything." Braca didn't answer. He let out a deep, rumbling growl. Not a threat, but something that made the entire forest shudder in agreement. As the stretcher was unfolded, Lena, Kate, and the rescue team lifted Rex with utmost care. Eli held his front paw and never let go. A streak of blood stained his shoulder. No one could tell if it was from Rex's wound or something deeper inside Eli that had torn open. The chimpanzees slowly backed away, watching until the forms of Rex and Eli faded behind the trees. Braca remained, standing in the last gray shaft of light touching the forest floor. He stared after them, then turned and disappeared into the mist, without a sound. By late morning, when the rescue helicopter lifted off, carrying a dog still breathing and the humans who had crossed the line between logic and love, Nightshade Forest was left with only wind and footprints, deep, clear, and forever etched in time. The helicopter's rotors thumped across the canopy like thunder from the heavens, heralding that something had changed. From above, shafts of light pierced the treetops like outstretched fingers from the sky, brushing across the bark, the tangled leaves, and finally, resting on the still form of Rex, strapped to the stretcher. Below, the rescue team finally reached the clearing, following the last signal Lena and Kate had managed to send before losing contact. They arrived like a final beam of light piercing the labyrinth of Nightshade Forest, not just to save a life, but to bear witness to a quiet farewell between humankind and the wild. Rex still lay motionless, eyes half closed, breathing slow but steady. Eli never left his side, his hand wrapped gently around Rex's front paw, as if holding on to a life suspended at the very edge. Beneath the gauze that Lena had wound tightly, the bleeding had stopped. His body, though exhausted, still radiated warmth, a fragile signal that his will to live hadn't yet faded. Lena looked up, her gaze sharp as the rescue team formed a perimeter. But they asked no questions. One of them simply stepped forward, voice soft as he approached Eli. "We'll get him out of here as quickly as we can. What about the rest of you?" Eli scanned the circle. Lena, Kate, the rescue crew, and the chimpanzees. Braca stood at the edge of the clearing, still as a tree that had learned to think. Behind him, Zara, Rix, Nomi, and Cora held their positions in a gentle arc. They didn't step forward, didn't howl, didn't wave. They simply watched. Braca's eyes never left Rex. Though his face remained wild, there was something deeper in his stare, a quiet ache not born of sound, but of understanding. The sorrow of watching a comrade leave, not through death, but because his purpose had been fulfilled. Kate murmured, "They know he's not coming back." Lena tightened her grip. "They're not trying to stop him. They're choosing to let him go." No one on the rescue team could fully comprehend it, but they could feel it, in the way the chimps stared, in the weight of the silence, in Braca's silent bow as Rex was lifted from the forest floor on a stretcher lined with white straps. A farewell ritual, spoken without words. From behind, police officers emerged from the shadowed woods, escorting Doyle in cuffs. Dirt smeared his face, his shirt torn down the back, and his eyes wide, disbelieving, like a man who still hadn't accepted his own defeat. A uniformed officer approached Eli. "You said this dog saved you. From that man?" Eli didn't answer right away. He looked down at Rex, then replied, "Not just me." He saved this forest from something far more dangerous than a gun: selfishness. The officer paused, then gave a slow nod. "Then I guess today, we owe him a life." The stretcher was hoisted carefully and moved toward a clearing between two low hills, where the waiting helicopter's blades churned wind into whirlwinds of dust and falling leaves. In the heart of that windstorm, Rex didn't stir, but one ear twitched faintly, as if he could still hear the rustling air, the familiar sounds of creatures who never spoke his language, yet had once protected him as one of their own. Braca raised a hand. He didn't wave. He simply held the gesture like a statue. A silent salute to a warrior who had lived, who had fought, who had fallen and risen again, not out of instinct, but out of love for someone he had chosen to believe in. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, Lena looked down at the forest one last time. From up here, Nightshade was nothing but an endless sea of dark green, mysterious, ancient. But she knew, somewhere in that sea was a hollow now, where a dog had once lain, where chimps had once shared fruit and water, where something thought lost had been reborn. Eli gripped Rex's paw tighter. The wind lashed his face, carrying his tears but never erasing the weight of what he felt. Rex's eyes stayed shut. But Eli knew. He was listening. Eli's cabin leaned gently at the forest's edge, where the first rays of morning sun kissed the wooden porch, and the breeze carried the scent of pine and the whisper of rustling branches. Not far beyond was Nightshade, the forest that had once taken from him, and somehow had also given something back. On the front steps, Rex lay with his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes no longer clouded as they once were. The bandages had been removed days ago, revealing a long, pale scar on his shoulder, a silver thread stitched by time. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't sit at command like a trained dog. He simply existed, present, calm, equal. A soul who had walked through death, stood between instinct and heart, and was now learning to live again, not as a tool, but as something more. Eli stepped outside with a chipped coffee mug and a slightly burnt piece of toast. He placed them gently on the wooden table, then sat on the steps beside Rex. No leash, no commands, no sit or stay. Just two beings side by side, in silence, like old friends who no longer needed words to understand each other. Eli reached down and gently stroked Rex's back. The fur had grown thick and warm again. No more the sharp outline of bones from those days in Nightshade. "We're home now, buddy," Eli murmured, a slow smile blooming on his face, a smile that hadn't come easily in years. "No one gives you orders anymore. No one gives me any either." Rex lifted his head and looked at him, amber eyes glinting with a trace of dawn. It wasn't a look that awaited command. It was one of knowing. Then he turned, gazing toward the forest. At the distant edge of Nightshade, the woods remained still, as if listening. There were no cries, no footprints, but Eli knew Braca and Rex's old companions were still out there, not to watch, not to guard, but simply to be, as part of the world Rex had once belonged to. Eli once thought about taking Rex back to the city, where the best vets lived, where it was safe, where there were no more gunshots or old scars. But in the end, when he saw the way Rex looked back at the forest one last time before they left, he understood. Rex didn't need the city. He only needed a porch, a line of sight back to the trees, and someone who didn't treat him like a shadow wrapped in fur. The days passed slowly. Eli wrote a few lines in the yellowed notebook he used to carry in the army. Not about wounds, not about enemies. Just this. He's here, and so am I. We both survived. Sometimes Rex would get up, limp a few circles around the dirt yard, still a little uneven on his feet, but every step he took without stumbling sent a quiet warmth blooming in Eli's chest. Kate and Lena dropped by once, bringing food and ointments. Lena left behind a photo, Rex and Braca, taken from afar, yet their eyes, though not the same species, met like true comrades. Eli framed it and hung it by the door. Beneath the photo he wrote in fading ink, "Not everyone who leaves the forest survives, but everyone who survives carries the forest inside them." Dusk fell like pale golden honey over the wooden roof and tree canopy. Rex lay on his side, catching the breeze sweeping in from deep within the woods. In his light doze, perhaps he dreamed of Braca, or maybe Rix, Nomi, or Kura, or maybe it was Eli's eyes, when Rex had stood between him and the gun. Eli placed a hand on Rex's head, not firm, not soft. "If you want to go back to the forest, I understand, but if you choose to stay, then this is home." The wind from the woods carried the scent of damp earth and resin. There was no reply, only Rex's steady breathing, and the soft thump of his tail on the wooden floor, like an answer spoken without sound. In the small kitchen, the yellow light cast long shadows across a faded tablecloth, where the three of them sat like survivors of a storm, not of wind and rain, but of a kind only those who had walked through Nightshade could truly understand. Lena sipped her tea, fingers circling the rim of an old ceramic mug. Kate sat beside her, eyes occasionally drifting to the porch, to where Rex slept, one leg tucked in, chest rising and falling in the cool night air. Eli stood, added a few logs to the fireplace. The flames leapt up, casting orange light onto the photo on the wall. Rex and Braca, framed in rough wood that looked like it had been carved from the edge of the forest itself. "I still can't believe it," Kate said softly. "It all really happened." Lena exhaled, her voice quiet but unwavering. "We saw it. We lived it. And now, it's our job to tell it, whether anyone believes it or not." When Lena and Kate returned to town, they carried with them a small tin box, cushioned with cloth and newspaper. All eyes turned to it. Inside, nestled quietly, lay an old rescue badge, scratched, dulled, but still bearing the faint engraving, Unit 21, K9, REX. In the sunlight, the silver gleamed faintly. But what silenced the room wasn't the name. It was the small mark near the edge of the badge, a faint scratch not made by accident. The trace of a touch from a being without fingers, but with a thumb. Braca. Lena told the story, how Rex had survived, how the chimpanzees had kept him alive, how they chose not to harm humans, but to protect, and how a dog thought long dead had returned like something out of a myth. At first, people didn't believe. Some scoffed, some shook their heads. But an old woman in the back of the town hall stood up, eyes glistening. "My father used to say, 'There are primates deep in the forest, smart ones. They won't attack unless threatened. Maybe they remember kindness.'" That night, the local news aired a short segment. A search and rescue dog named Rex, believed to have perished 3 years ago in a landslide, has been found alive, reportedly cared for by a troop of wild chimpanzees. Authorities are still verifying the story, but what's undeniable is this: the dog's badge remains intact, marked with an unexplainable sign. Below the article, hundreds of comments poured in. "No way this is real." "A fairy tale in modern times?" "German shepherds, man, loyal to the last breath." "Does anyone know where Rex is now? I want to send him a gift." Eli read them all, didn't reply, just smiled faintly. Inside the cabin, Rex lay curled near the fire. When Eli placed the badge around his neck again, not with a chain or a collar, just a soft fabric band like a wrist tie, Rex didn't react, but his eyes flickered. You remember this? Eli whispered. No reply. But the next morning, Eli found Rex standing at the door, as usual, gazing out towards the forest. This time, though, his head dipped slightly, letting the morning sun strike the badge, now glowing faintly like a story being retold. Not a symbol of glory, but of a tale. A tale in which a name was no longer just a service ID, but proof of survival, of kindness, and of a loyalty no one could shake. That day, a group of students from the local high school came to visit Eli and Rex. Amid the cheerful chatter, one little girl reached out, touching the badge gently, and whispered, "My name's June. My mom said this dog once saved her during the flood." Eli looked at Rex, and in that instant, Rex stood, slowly, walked over to the girl, and sat. No command, no signal. Because the story of Rex had found its way back into the human heart, not through headlines or orders, but through breath, through scars, and through the look in his eyes that still knew how to speak. Dawn always reached the forest's edge, a breath sooner than it did the town. When the light finally slipped through the thick canopy of nightshade, it spread across the dew-soaked grass like a quiet offering from nature to those who had survived. And at that hour, each day, Eli and Rex would appear, not with fanfare, but as a man and a dog, casting a long shadow together over the deep green floor of the forest. No leash, no commands. Eli walked a few steps ahead, never turning back, but he knew Rex was always there, just behind him, each step steady, requiring no signal. And if Rex stopped, Eli would always sense it and stop too. Two souls once broken, now walking side by side, as if the distance between man and dog had never existed. Rex's ears still turned toward the forest with every breeze. He hadn't stepped back in since the day they left, but he still listened. He still recognized the rustling of leaves, the crisp snap of a branch, the soft thump of forest fruit hitting the ground, or even the distant calls of birds he once knew by sound alone. Eli had noticed, every morning, when they paused at the small overlook above the valley, once the boundary to the deepest part of the woods, Rex would sit first, ears high, eyes not on Eli, but on the far-off treetops where sunlight brushed the pine needles like liquid ink. Some days, Eli would whisper, "They're still in there, buddy." Rex didn't react. But Eli knew. He understood. The story of Rex continued to spread. A few reports surfaced with grainy forest footage, shaky, unclear, but unmistakable. A group of chimpanzees encircling a dog lying on a bed of fallen leaves. Local news crews reached out, eager to interview Eli. A well-known wildlife magazine offered to put Rex on the cover of a special issue, calling him the survivor who carried the heart of both worlds. One animal welfare organization even sent an invitation for Rex to attend an award ceremony in the city to receive a Medal of Bravery. Eli read the letter one evening as the wind whispered through the cabin windows. Rex lay near the hearth, his head resting on his paws. At the sound of rustling paper, he looked up, meeting Eli's eyes. "They want to give you a medal," Eli smiled, folding the letter. "Want you to make a speech or something." Rex gave two soft tail thumps against the wooden floor, not loud, not eager, just enough to say he understood and agreed. Medals could be hung, trophies could be displayed, but survival and loyalty needed no certificate. The next morning, when Eli opened the door, Rex was already on the porch, looking out toward the forest. Not waiting, not searching, just remembering. Eli stepped forward, gently touching the fur on Rex's neck where the old badge still hung from the soft fabric. No longer shiny, but more real now that time had worn it down. "Shall we walk, kid?" "No need to wait." Rex turned, stepping off the porch. Eli followed. Together they reached the edge of the woods. together they looked on. And for the first time, Eli slowly removed the badge from around Rex's neck. He didn't put it away. He didn't hide it. He hung it on a branch beside the narrow path that led into the trees, so anyone passing by would see it. Not as a call, but as a reminder that once a dog lived here, who fell here, who stood before a gun here, and still chose forgiveness. Rex sat beside him. His eyes didn't look at the badge. They looked toward the forest. Eli said nothing more, because everything worth saying had already been lived, and needed no repeating. The evening settled softly over the forest's edge, like a kind hand soothing the world after a long day. The final light wasn't blazing, but honeygold, drifting through the leaves, painting the porch and clinging to the roof of the small cabin, where Eli and Rex had lived through several seasons of change. No more noise from town, no more persistent questions from the press, only forest wind, the occasional solitary bird call, and a peace so deep it silenced even the heart's chatter. The wooden table on the porch had grown older, patched and repaired by Eli's hands. New screws here, a few reclaimed boards there. On it sat 2 mugs, one for a guest, one for him. Beside the table, Rex lay stretched out, his head on a worn blanket, his eyes half closed, ears still alert, as if resting while listening to the forest breathe. A visitor came, a young researcher, drawn by the legend of Rex and Braca, the claw mark on the badge, the survival story too wild to be believed. He brought a camera, notebooks, and 100 questions. But when he saw Rex, lying there, free, with nothing left to prove, he simply stopped, sat down, and said nothing for a long while. Eli poured the tea, his voice low but warm. "He's not just my dog. He's part of this place." The visitor looked up. Maybe he had heard dozens of tales about strange animals and supernatural bonds between humans and the wild. But in Eli's eyes that day, there was something no photograph could capture, a stillness born of a soul once abandoned by the world, but welcomed back by nature itself. The wind from the forest slipped through the cracks in the wooden planks, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, crushed leaves, and something else, something like memory. Rex stirred, not in reaction, but as if feeling something deeper. In the amber light of dusk filtering through his ears, his golden fur turned the color of aged amber, glistening like his own gaze from years ago, when he stood in floodwaters to save lives, when he braced against falling stones to shield his team, and when he lay in Braca's arms, breathing as if each breath might be the last. Eli stepped forward and sat down beside him. He didn't reach out, didn't say his name. He simply sat, eyes on the forest. "You don't have to go back," he said softly. "But I know. You still carry it in your heart." Rex lifted his head, eyes opening slowly. One ear twitched. Then he stretched, stood, not fast, not slow, and circled once around Eli before settling at his feet, resting his head gently on Eli's old boot. It wasn't the gesture of a trained animal. It was the quiet ritual of beings who had come to understand each other down to the bone. The evening sky deepened to burnt orange, tree shadows stretching like brush strokes across the horizon. A flock of birds passed overhead, their calls brief and lonely, before vanishing into silence. From afar, Nightshade Forest remained still, but within that stillness pulsed life, breath, and 1,000 unseen eyes watching one of their own. Braca would not return. But Eli believed it was still there, perhaps in the highest branch, perhaps by the stream where Rex once drank, or perhaps in the steady, uncommanded steps of a dog who no longer served orders, only his own will. The young visitor rose, quietly sliding his camera back into his bag without taking a single shot. Before he left, he turned and said, Maybe. Some stories aren't meant to be told completely. Just witnessed. Eli nodded. He didn't walk him out. The small gate creaked open on a gust of wind, then closed again as the visitor disappeared from the forest's edge. On the porch, Rex lay still, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in calm rhythm. He didn't stir, didn't flinch. He simply existed, part of the wood, the soil, the forest. But the only part that knew how to love, how to remember, and how to forgive. Eli looked up at the sky, lips moving in a silent prayer. Thank you for coming back. The twilight faded into velvet dark, but the night no longer felt frightening. Because in that little home beside the woods, two souls, a man and a dog, had chosen each other again. Not for glory, not for duty, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Some stories don't need to be bound in books, don't require medals or applause. They live quietly, persistently, like a dog lying on a porch each evening, eyes turned toward the forest where it once nearly lost everything, and where it found itself again. Rex wasn't just a German shepherd. He was a symbol of unwavering loyalty, of the ability to forgive even after betrayal, and of a life force strong enough to defy instinct itself. He didn't need to be called a hero, because sometimes simply staying, silently, protectively, and without walking away when you're needed most, is the greatest act of all. From an outcast expelled by mankind, Rex had been chosen by the forest, sheltered by nature, and finally, welcomed back into the human heart. His story wasn't just about survival, but a quiet reminder that every creature, no matter its form, deserves love, deserves to be heard, and deserves a life worth living. German shepherds, with their intelligence, devotion, and deeply feeling hearts, aren't just companions. They are family, memory, the most human part of us. And if there is one truth Rex left behind on his journey, it is this. Do not judge a soul by where it came from. Look at how it chooses to stay.